While Star Trek episodes can range from incredibly intense to downright bizarre, there's just something about the super sad episodes that tug at the heartstrings. At some point, anyone who decides to explore the Alpha Quadrant will likely experience losing a loved one, witnessing the destruction of an entire planet, or, at the very least, getting trapped in an uncomfortable situation with no clear path of escape. In this live stream, we're going to be counting down the top 10 most tragic episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. So grab a box of tissues and let's start the show. Welcome to the Savage Stream, the weekly live stream where we talk all things Star Trek. I'm your host, Sharice, the Sci-Fi Savage, and today we are going to be counting down the top 10 saddest episodes from Star Trek: The Next Generation. So if you have a moment, a most memorable, super sad moment, drop it in the chat so that way we can see if that moment makes the list. In the meantime, let's get started with number 10 on the list. Season 3, Episode 20, Tin Man. The Enterprise is sent to make contact with a sentient spaceship/alien life form known as Tin Man. Tam is a telepathic betazoid who feels tortured by the constant thoughts of those around him. Before the Romulans can capture or destroy Tin Man, Tam decides to replace the ship's long-dead crew. Ultimately, Tin Man, aka Gom2, throws all the ships clear before a nearby star goes supernova, and everyone lives happily ever after. So this episode I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. First of all, it made the list because it is the least sad of the sad episodes we're going to go over. So that's why it's number 10. I think there's a lot of layers in this episode, and I think it's got a lot of tragic moments, but in the end, I do think they all end up happily ever after. So this is like a good soft one to ease us into the conversation. So in this episode, Tam, who's a betazoid, he's always been like this. Ever since he was born, he could hear everyone's thoughts and feel all their emotions, and it was always very overwhelming for him. In this episode, he spends most of his time with Data because he can't read Data's mind, and it's just like a relief. However, he can still hear everyone's thoughts and conversations going on in the entire Enterprise. When they come along this ship, the ship is named Gom2, but they call it Tin Man. The sentient ship, or the alien that is also a ship, used to have a full crew, of entire crew complement. And I guess the crew was also telepathic, but there was some kind of radiation event and they all died. So that's already super sad. And Tin Man, the ship itself, is like millennia old, but who knows when its crew died. And it's been just traveling around the galaxy all by itself, looking for anyone who could communicate with it so it wasn't all alone. And when this episode opens up, the Enterprise is rushing to where the ship is because the ship is sitting right next to this star that's about to go supernova. And so the Enterprise is like, we got to figure out a way to get the ship away from there because the ship's going to be destroyed. Well, it turns out the ship knew very well it was going to be destroyed, and it just parked there on purpose. It just couldn't go on one more day throughout the galaxy all by itself. And when Tam arrives, Tam is like, dude, I get you. You know, Tam's like the opposite, right? Tam has been overwhelmed with people and inputs, sensory inputs, and all this madness. And he just wants peace and quiet. And on the other hand, Tin Man was used to having a whole crew of people, and now it has nothing. So in the end of the episode, Tam really bonds with the ship and is like, hey, let's go on together. Like, let's go explore the galaxy together. So when they make that decision, that's the exact same moment that the star goes supernova. Of course it is. But the ship is able to, Gom2 is able to throw everybody clear so that everyone else is safe, beams Data back on board, which is cool because now we know the ship also has the capacity to beam things in and out all on its own, which is so cool. And then presumably the ship and Tam go off to search the galaxy. I think this is such, like, the sad parts, it's such a good episode, right? It's such a sweet episode. It's really bittersweet, which is why it's way at 10. But I think one of the things that's sad is that Tam has had to go through his whole life being simultaneously overwhelmed by people and at the same time isolated, completely isolated from people, right? Because no one understands him. And in the beginning of the episode, we find out from Counselor Troy that this used to be one of her patients because he needed help managing all the things going on through his head. He's also not the most sociable of people. Like he doesn't have a high EQ. And it's hard to have a high EQ when you know exactly what someone's thinking, right? Like it's hard to pretend like you don't know. It's hard to act like, when someone's talking crap about you, but in their mind, but you can read their mind. It's hard to be like, oh, and smile in their face. So yeah, he has no people skills, and he's isolated in so many ways. They don't understand who he is. He doesn't understand how they are. He doesn't understand how to communicate with other people. And so for some reason they made this person an ambassador. So he's been traveling from culture to culture, and he found one culture that he really likes because they think so slowly. It takes them like weeks and weeks to form a thought. And so he just feels like at least he gets peace in that culture. But yeah, I think it's really sad that he's been alone his whole life. I also think it's really sad that the ship's been alone for who knows how long since it's lost its entire crew. Um, I'm glad that they find each other and that they don't go supernova. And it also kind of gives me hope that maybe they can go find some other telepathic species who also feel isolated from their communities to kind of repopulate the crew. How cool would that be? Because presumably the ship can't die, or it's not going to die of old age anytime soon. So how cool would that be if they could just, if it's not just the two of them, but if they have a few more people on the ship who can all maybe control their thoughts, or maybe it's a bunch of people who can't read, Tam can't read their thoughts, so he's not overwhelmed. And they can actually have a society. Because I do feel like I'm happy for the two of them, but also I think that's also pretty lonely if it's just the two of them. Like, how long is that going to last? And eventually Tam will die because he doesn't live forever, like maybe the ship does. And then the ship is kind of back where it started. So yeah, this is number 10. It's sad. It's bittersweet. I think it does have a happy ending. And I think it's a beautifully told story. So I'm going to check the chat and then go to number 9 on the list. But before I go to the chat, if you're enjoying this so far, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe because we do conversations like this every single week. All right, heading over to the chat. There is a lot going on in the chat. Hello to PS2 Cypher who put first. PS2 Cypher was a little sneaky because he put first yesterday. I noticed that. One Grace says aloha. Andrea says hello, friend. OMG Picard with the Ruskin flute and the LOL episode. So, and then Nadia says, Quebec in the house. So the thing with the Ruskin flute, I'm going to talk about that later. No, I'm going to talk about it now because it doesn't even fit in the other thing I was going to say. So I had made this like trivia question with all these Star Trek trivia questions, which, by the way, at the end of this episode, I'm also going to drop a trivia question. But I had made this video that just had a bunch of Trek trivia questions. And one of the questions was, what instrument does Picard play? And it was like, I don't know, guitar, piano, trombone, and flute. So trombone was a little one to trip people up if they're only a little bit familiar with Star Trek TNG and they know somebody plays the trombone. But why did I get hundreds and hundreds of angry nerds, and I love me some nerds, but not the angry ones, angry nerds who are like, it's not a flute, it's a Ressican flute. And I was like, is that not in the flute family? It has flute in the name. Is it a piano? Is it a guitar? I think flute's still fine. But they were like, no, you can't call it a flute. You have to call it a Ressican flute. That's the correct terminology. And then other people would come into the conversation and be like, well, Ressican flute's not even what it should be called because that's just what you would say in English, but that's not their native language because the universal translator, so that's really not even its name. And I mean, it just went really deep. So now I guess forevermore, I can only say Ressican flute. I could never just say flute because apparently that's incorrect. Okay, so Nadia says, okay, so this episode is not one of my favorites. The best thing about it is that the actor that plays Tam ends up playing the mayor on Buffy as the best villain. Andrea says, I love the thread from TNG to Buffy. So there you go. And Nadia says, my 2 favorite shows of all time, bar none, which is so great. Andrea says, it's not my favorite episode, but I love that they showed a character that is over it and can't deal with the overstimulation and finally found peace. I love that. Which is true because you kind of get these characters sometimes in the show that are just like really what's the word? Like nothing bothers them. Sometimes we have characters that nothing bothers them, or something terrible happens, they go to Counselor Troy and she's like, buck up, you'll be fine by next episode. And they're like, right? And you want to see a little more affect, a little more concern, a little more stress, a little more fear, something. You want to see regular human people emotions in these stressful situations. And I really do like that about this episode. I like that Tam is just like a person who's overstimulated, who's got too many things going on. I feel like we can all relate to that. And I can't think of another character that you see that's like this. I mean, maybe Reg Barclay because he's a little ball of anxiety, but Tam is not anxious. He's overwhelmed. He's overstimulated. He's overconnected, right? And that's different. And I think he plays it very differently too. You see him get so frustrated and upset and irritated with everything, which you never see Barclay getting irritated. Unless it's in a holodeck. Nadia says, yeah, you could definitely feel for Tam. Talk about intrusion. He gets no quiet at all. And I was just complaining about my 9-year-old kid wanting all my attention nonstop. Yeah, seriously, like kids could probably help you feel what Tam is going through. Let's see. Yeah. Nadia says, LOL, it's not a flute. Oh, my stars. Oh, my stars and garters. LOL. Yes, absolutely. And then Nadia says, I'm loving the interface with chat sometimes being posted. Yeah, we're trying to do some new stuff. It's harder than it looks. So who knows how long the new stuff's going to last, but we're going to try some new stuff. All right. So that brings us to number 9 on the list. And I'm guessing from the chat that no one else had this episode on their list, which is super interesting. I wonder what other episodes I picked as super sad that you did not even think about, and what episodes you picked as super sad that I did not even think about. With that, let's move on to number 9 on the list. Season 7, Episode 9, Force of Nature. The Enterprise encounters 2 scientists, Rabal and Sarova, who claim that excessive warp drive use is causing irreversible damage to the fabric of space. Data's investigation shows that the siblings' findings have merit but require further study. Sarova feels like the danger is too huge to wait, so she sacrifices herself to prove their theories. In the aftermath, Starfleet agrees to limit travel through this area of space to Warp 5, except in emergencies. But there's no guarantee non-Federation planets will agree. So basically, Sarova died for nothing. So this episode is a really hard one to watch. I think I've seen it. I'm sure I saw it when it aired, although I don't remember it. I saw it for sure one time when we were reviewing it for our podcast, the TNG podcast, a Star Trek show, which Andrea in the chat was my co-host for that. So that's the only time I actually recollect seeing this episode. This episode is such a bummer. So on the one hand, the episode itself is not that engaging. It's not that exciting. Like when you're watching it, you're not like, ooh, what's going to happen next? So that's one reason why it's a little bit forgettable. But the reason why it's on this list is not that it's sad as much as depressing. So this is kind of, I think this episode is supposed to be an analogy or an allegory for global warming, which is pretty forward thinking for 1989 or whatever this episode was made, 1991, whenever this episode came out. But the thing about this episode, which is similar to real global warming, is it's like there's not one nice cookie cutter solution by the end of the episode. And I think that's what makes it really depressing and upsetting. So these siblings, they're like, stop flying through this space. There's this little corridor by their planet that is like a freeway. So ships are using it all the time to get from point A to point B. For whatever reason, they can't go around, even though it's space. Space is in 3 dimensions. They cannot possibly go around in any way, shape, or form. They have to go straight through this little tunnel because it's the fastest way from point A to point B. And so there's a planet near this tunnel. And these siblings are saying every time people go through this tunnel, they're messing up space, and warp travel itself is messing up space. And there's a rift that's forming, and it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's going to swallow up our planet. And I forget what that rift will do to the planet. If it'll like blow it up or destroy its atmosphere or poison it. I don't remember, but something where people can no longer stay on the planet. Whatever happens, people can't stay on the planet. So these siblings have put a bunch of booby traps throughout the corridor. So any ship that goes through reads some kind of distress signal. And when they go to it, the device explodes and it cuts off their warp drive. So they can't escape. Or I suppose they could escape, but not with using warp. Um, so they're kind of forcing people to go through their space below warp drive to try to protect their area of space. So anyways, the Enterprise figures this out, beams them on board. They have a conversation and the siblings are like, look at our findings, look at our research, we can prove it. But Data's like, yeah, I mean, maybe, but we won't know without further study. And Sarova's like, well, if we keep on studying it, it's going to be too late and our planet's going to be gone by the time we finish studying it. So that's when she decides to blow herself up, totally unnecessarily, by the way, because she could have remotely programmed her shuttle to detonate and had the exact same results, but whatever. She destroys herself and her ship to prove that this rift exists, because as soon as her ship blows up, the rift shows up. And they're like, wow, she was right all along. So what do you think happened? Do you think Starfleet was like, oh man, this is terrible. We're going to stop doing this from now on? Of course not. Not only do they not restrict warp travel, but they say, okay, you can only travel at warp 5. That's 5 out of 10. That's still warp travel, because they could say you can only travel at impulse, whatever the heck, whatever impulse speed is right underneath warp 1. They could say you can only travel impulse speed through this little corridor. It's still faster than going around. So let's all be happy with that. But they don't. They're like, okay, we're going to limit it to warp 5. And then they say, unless it's an emergency, and then just go like warp 9.9. So really, they didn't do anything. And then Worf says, like, hey, that's great for the Federation, but what about everything that's not in the Federation, like the Ferengi, Cardassians, Romulans, like anybody else? And he says, I think the Klingons will go along with it because they're allies, but like, they don't have to. So really, nobody's going to be following this. So what's the solution? And I think there's some kind of moral of the story at the end where it's Picard or Geordi or something. They say something like, who knew that the very technology that gets us around could also be harmful, or something they say. And that's it. There's the moral of the story is like, doesn't it suck to be us? And that's kind of how I feel about global warming. I feel like it really sucks to be us, because there are people working on solutions, thank God. And you know, I'm on that bandwagon. I drive an electric car and try to do my part, but it's like the problem is so big. It's so much bigger than a pair of siblings who are trying to ring the alarm and save the day alone, right? It needs so much more work than that. So anyways, this episode made the list because it's super depressing and it's not on my rewatch list. And if you haven't seen it in a while, maybe give it a skip. But I do think it is sad. And at the end, you're just like, wow, the world's a terrible place. And I try to stay away from things that leave me feeling like that by the end. But for today's conversation, I thought it was perfection. All right, so I'm going to check the chat and then we're going to hit number 8 on the list. PS2 Cypher says, yeah, I hated that episode. I'm not sure if you're talking about this episode or the last episode with Tin Man, or both. Nadia's like, yep, not a huge fan. That was for this episode. Andrea says, hey, TNG podcast. Whoop, whoop. PS2 Cypher says, all this episode did was give the producers an excuse to redesign the starships. Oh, I guess so. You know, I was just talking to some Trek friends yesterday about how I don't know anything about starships. Like there's, you know, I was potentially going to do a video about like the different classes of ships and stuff like that. And then I was like, but wait, I don't know anything about that. So I'm not even going to touch that because I don't know what I'm talking about. It wasn't until Andrea pointed out that there was all these different classes of ships. I didn't even know that. She was like, oh yeah, there's Galaxy class and this class and that class. And I was like, which makes sense too, because Andrea, what do you call people who love cars? Are they called gearheads or what are they called? Whatever that's called, Andrea's a car person. So it makes sense that she would also like get the ships thing. And since I'm not a car person, I don't get the car thing or the ship thing. So I wouldn't even notice. Redesign the ships, redesign away. I would not even notice that. Nadia says, good thing Voyager ended up out in the Gamma Quadrant. No warp 5 limit. They would have taken forever. If you think about it, the Enterprise, the max speed was warp 5, and everyone was all excited about it. And there's nothing wrong with warp 5, but it's just like not a solution for this problem when they say warp drive is tearing up space and it's going to destroy our planet. And the solution's like, okay, we'll go slightly less warp drive. When you could do all the way, you back all the way up to impulse, or like I said, you could have people go around. Or you could just have this guerrilla warfare where these siblings and everyone that they can combine on their side is just planting mines and bombs and things all in the corridor so that people just don't use it. Andrea says, "Yep, gearheads." Okay, so Andrea's a gearhead. So it makes sense that she would get all the ships and know that they're different. Where I'm just like, okay, round one, big one, little one with wings. Um, PS2 Cypher says that is why Voyager had the variable nacelles. Then the Enterprise E was streamlined to avoid the warp damage. Oh, that's interesting. Interesting. Nadia says, I meant Delta Quadrant. We know what you meant. We know you meant Delta Quadrant. Um, that's interesting. The streamlined nacelles to avoid warp damage. I was gonna say maybe I'll look into ships, but probably I won't. It's on my list. We'll see how far it gets on the list. Okay, so now let's go to number 8 on the list of most sad TNG episodes and see if this one made anyone else's list. Season 7, Episode 13, Homeward. Worf's foster brother, Nikolai Rozhenko, violates the Prime Directive to save a pre-warp village from a dying planet by secretly transporting them to the Enterprise's holodeck. Worf and Nikolai work together to lead the Barallans on a long journey to their new village, while the Enterprise rushes to the nearest uninhabited M-class planet. Vorin accidentally exits the holodeck and is shocked by what he finds. He decides to commit ritual suicide rather than live a lie with his people. So this episode is another one that's not my favorite. If you haven't seen this in a while, definitely give this one a skip. Definitely give this one a skip. However, here's why it made the list. It made the list because of Vorin. Because of Vorin and all of the Barallans. And also the entire Barallan planet. So in this episode, Nikolai, who I don't know why he's on this planet. I think he's some kind of, I don't think he's an ambassador, but he's some kind of maybe scientist who investigates pre-warp societies or something like that. But he calls the Federation for help. And he's like, you got to help. This planet's atmosphere is about to be dissolved and every single person on the planet is going to die. And when the Enterprise shows up, Picard's like, yeah, I can't help you because they're pre-warp. And the Prime Directive says we can't interfere with other cultures. This is one of those Prime Directive, Schmime Directive things that drives me bananas. It's like when they do and don't enforce the Prime Directive is so nutty. And in this case, it's like, well, they're pre-warp, so we can't interfere. However, if you don't interfere, the entire planet is going to die and they will never be warp capable, right? They're never even going to get there. And I get that anything you do is interference, but I don't get how you could stand by and watch the entire planet's atmosphere dissolve with just a moment of silence and then go about your merry way, especially when if this society was warp capable, but just unable to affect their atmosphere, which we've seen a lot of other planets where, like in the episode Inheritance, where Data meets his robot mom, where that planet had a lot of instability because of earthquakes, but the planet had warp capable people. So the Enterprise was able to reignite the magma inside the center of the planet to stop all the earthquakes. So that way the planet would be fine and everybody could still live on it. So to me, in this case, if the Barallans were warp capable, but did not have the technology to fix their atmosphere, the Enterprise would have happily helped them. It would have been like, cool, you've got warp, we've got warp. We're going to shoot some torpedoes into the atmosphere and they're going to explode and chemicals and whatever. And your atmosphere is suddenly magically restored. The only reason they didn't get saved is because they're pre-warp. And we don't want to, we don't want to mess with their evolution. But I would argue that standing by and watching their evolution end is also kind of messing with it, right? Like it's this idea that doing nothing is not an action. And I don't agree with that. I think doing nothing is an action. So for example, if you're walking down the street and you see somebody get jumped and you just stand there and watch, or you just take out your phone and record it or something like that, you are taking an action. You not doing anything is an action. That is a choice to let what you're seeing, to let, whatever's happening continue. That's a choice. So it galls me. The beginning of this episode is so heartbreaking. The whole planet destroyed in an instant just because they're not pre-warp. Just because they're pre-warp, I think is really awful. Okay, so that's awful layer number 1 in this little awful cake. Layer number 2 comes when despite Prime Directive and all of that, um, Nikolai finds a way to secretly beam one village worth of people onto the holodeck and trick them into thinking that they're in some kind of cave and they're still on the planet, even though the planet's been destroyed. That part's not sad. That part's just really sneaky, but I understand why he did it. But also, it's like he saved that village because his girlfriend, his pregnant girlfriend, oh, maybe we could call her wife. His pregnant wife was a part of that village because I feel like that's the Prime Directive part right there. It's like if you're studying these people, don't introduce your genes into their gene pool. That will mess up their development. That will mess up their evolution. I feel like that was the wrong thing to do. But um, he beams them in secretly, and he's preserved this one little village of people. And in doing so, now he's tied Captain Picard's hands because Picard can't send him back to the planet with no atmosphere, right? Because that would be inhumane. So even though they're pre-warped, now that they're on the ship, he's got nothing. He's got no other options but to save these people. So on Nikolai's side, that his plan, his big master plan, totally worked out. The Enterprise does find another planet. They are able to resettle them, and Nikolai spins some yarn about we had to go on this journey, and now we're in this new planet, and it's going to be harsher conditions, but we can make it work. Whatever. The second layer of sad comes from Vorin, who somehow who makes his way out of the holodeck accidentally, and that's because the amount of power needed to run the holodeck consistently for like 72 hours, making this entire fake planet and a whole long journey on the planet, all these things, the power was running out. And so they were trying to rush to get to the new planet. And as the power was fading, different parts of the holodeck kept breaking. And you could see like the holodeck, I don't know what you call it, but like the green screen part of it or whatever. And so, of course, the villagers are like, what's that? You know, and Worf is there and Nikolai's there to be like, oh, it's an omen from the gods saying we're going the right way or whatever. But like things kept messing up. The water would mess up, the walls would mess up. And that's how Vorin got out because an arch appeared and he was like, what's that? And he walks through. So now he realizes not only that something is terribly wrong because he's on a spaceship, not on the planet, but he also comes to this realization that his entire planet's gone, right? Because Beverly and Picard tell him, I'm so sorry your planet was destroyed. We're taking you to another planet. Because of the way his brain was, because of the way his brain works, they were not able to do a memory wipe, which was their first choice, was to just wipe his memory and plant him back with his people. So he had to keep all these memories that everything he believed was a lie. And he could either go back to his people and just not say anything, or he could stay on the Enterprise and just leave his people. And they would make up some story about how he was lost in the caves or whatever. And he really thought about it because he was like, you know, these two options kind of suck, right? It was like, if I stay on the Enterprise, I'm not a warp capable civilization. Imagine the culture shock of that. And now you've got to adapt and try to understand all these technologies. You know, I mean, these people were like agrarian. These people were like probably had oil lanterns or something. And now you go to spaceships and replicators and stuff. That's just a really big jump to make. But I think he could have done it. But his thing was he would have been too lonely without everyone who's ever known, his entire village. That was the thing. It's like, I don't want to be isolated, which again, this kind of goes back to Tin Man. And then if he goes back with his people, he's going to want to tell them the truth. But if he speaks the truth, which was his point, everyone's going to think he's crazy. And again, he'll be isolated. Everyone will remove him from the group because he's a crazy person. So that means he'll have to pretend like everything's A-okay and like nothing has changed. And he felt like he couldn't in good conscience do that. So he chose ritual suicide. He didn't choose option A or option B. He chose option C, which I think, again, is really sad. He didn't have a lot of good choices. But man, he made the only one that was permanent. Like, he could have always changed his mind had he done one or the other, had he gone back to his people, especially since now he knows the truth about, well, I don't know if he ever learned the truth about Nikolai, but he would have, right? If he'd gone back, at least he and Nikolai could be like, hey, man, there's a real world out there, or something, right? He could have had an ally or someone where he doesn't sound like a crazy person. But he didn't make any of those choices. And I just think the episode's really sad. And it ends on that. It ends on Vorin's ritual suicide. And then the next scene is like all the Barallans are beamed to the planet and Worf and Nikolai hug and they're like, everything worked out. Yay. And the Enterprise kind of goes along their way. I think this episode's just a bummer. It's just a bummer. Definitely give it a skip if you haven't seen it in a while. All right, I'm going to check the chat and then we're going to hit number 7 on the list. So many things in the chat. Um, okay. When Grace says, "Ah, yes, a slightly lower budget insurrection." Um, when Grace, when was Insurrection made? Was Insurrection made after this episode? Because this is season 7, and I don't remember the order of the movies, if all the movies came after the show ended or if some came before the show ended. But yes, it is the slightly lower budget Insurrection. Andrea says, "Charisse, the recap videos are wonderful. Thank you so much. It literally took me all day for these 10 30-second clips. So you're welcome." Um, Nadia says, "Truth, not a fan of this episode either. I think I should be the head of the I Hate Nikolai club. He is annoying." Do you hate Nikolai because why do you hate Nikolai, Nadia? Do you hate him because he's just an annoying person? Do you hate him because he forced Picard into this into this tough situation, like because he could? Do you hate him because of what he did or who he is? I'm just curious. Um, Michelle. Hey, Michelle. Michelle says, "I agree. The recaps are really well done. Thank you so much." Um, Nadia says, "I love when Charisse and Andrea go off on the prime directive. I mean, the prime suggestion." Yeah. Spoiler alert, there's a whole video coming about the prime suggestion because I feel like I need to talk about it way more than I have. I need an entire episode dedicated to all the times when the prime directive was dumb, which is all the times when the prime directive was used or ignored. PS2 Cypher says, "Remember the episode where they used the Enterprise to fix a pre-war planet's atmosphere? It was the one with the imposter time traveler." Oh, what was that episode? Um, I am blanking. When Grace might remember. I'm blanking on the name of that episode. Um, the imposter time traveler. I know the one you're talking about, but I'm blanking on the episode, and I don't remember if that was a good episode because that's why it's blank because I think it was one of those ones where I like deleted it after I watched it. Um, but yeah, if that happened, it'll be in the Prime Directive Schmime Directive video, so we can talk about it a little bit more. Andrea says, "That's what it is. Let's not interact with this pre-warp civilization. 12 to beam down." Oh my gosh. Nadia says, "You guys kill me. I love the Wednesday nights. They're so great. I love them also." Michelle says, "I agree. Doing nothing is definitely a choice." Well said. Yeah, doing nothing's a choice. And I just don't, I'm so surprised. Am I surprised? Disheartened when people don't realize that. And they're like, "Well, I'm just going to stay out of it." And it's something where it's like you're witnessing something. Staying out of it is a choice. I'm not saying it's wrong to do, but just acknowledge that that's the choice you're making. I'm choosing to let this continue. I am choosing to let that happen. Like, just acknowledge that. And then at least you're kind of, you're aware of your complicity as opposed to being like, "Well, I'm not going to intervene. So therefore it has nothing to do with me." Cause that's like the cop out of like, I don't know, both sides are hard to pick. So I'm not going to pick one. And you don't always have to pick sides, right? It depends on the scenario. But I do think doing nothing in the face of something like a whole planet being destroyed is a choice. Michelle says, "I visited the Galapagos Islands and they do things similarly. We saw a hurt baby seal on the beach and we were not allowed to help because they wanted to leave the islands as untouched as possible." Ugh. Yeah, exactly. Okay, but that is that's like prime directive, right? Like that is a choice. They're saying if you see a hurt animal, leave it alone because this is the circle of life. But that's a choice, right? They're not just saying like, "Oh, a baby seal. Oh, well, if I help it, if I don't, I'm just not going to do anything." And that way I'm like not really responsible. It's like, no, they have made the choice. Do not get involved for this reason. And it's very much like prime directive. And I feel like, from the biological standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. But I know you, Michelle, absolutely love animals. So for you, it probably makes no sense in any scenario to do that. And I also would point out that if I was the baby seal, I'd feel very differently about that. Like if I was the Barowlins, I don't care about the prime directive. I don't care that there's warp capable species. Save my planet. Like save the planet. Replace the atmosphere. You don't even have to tell me you were here. It's fine. You know what I mean? Like if I was the Barowlins, I would want them to intervene. When Grace says, "Meanwhile, Voyager can run the holodecks continuously for a decade with no power issues. Yeah, that's because the Voyager, they already knew going into the Badlands that they needed to upgrade that holodeck system because on the Enterprise, it could only last for 3 days. Voyager needed it to last for who knows how long, turns out 7 years. But remember in the Fairhaven episodes, the holodeck had the same issue. It did start breaking down, and all the Fairhaven people, what was it called? Spirit Folk, that episode. All the Fairhaven people started seeing the breakdowns, and the doctor was playing the preacher, and he was like, "It's because of your sins," or whatever. So that they did do that same trope. Although they ran that holodeck program for like weeks or something before it broke down. It wasn't just 3 days. Nadia says they couldn't keep the holodeck running for a few days, but Tom and Harry could keep the Fairhaven running perpetually in Voyager. Go figure. Okay, I should have just read the next comment. I didn't even need to speak. Did not even need to say anything. When Grace says, "Too bad Worf didn't know Bashir yet." He's good at deleting memories from people Worf knows. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says all the TNG movies came after the series, and Insurrection was about 4 years after TNG wrapped. Okay, good to know, because I don't remember. Okay, so maybe that was the inspiration for Insurrection. Nadia says, "Why do I hate Nikolai? All of the above. Ultimately, he is selfish and has no boundaries." Yeah, he certainly does not respect anyone else's boundaries. That's for sure. Andrea says that's the one with Fleming Rasmussen. Yes, it's the one with it's the one with the guy who has the worst name in the history of names. Fleming Rasmussen. The episode was called A Matter of Time. Oh, it wasn't. It was Berlinghoff Rasmussen. Either way, this is awful. It's awful. And I don't remember what happened in that episode. Princess says I always cry in the inner light. Right? Oh, me too. Me too. You know me so well. Yes. PS2 Cypher says just as long as we're not clubbing the baby seals. Yeah, as long as we're not clubbing them, we're just loving them. And then Nadia says we can club Nikolai instead. Or we could just talk to him. You know, we could try that too. EAE says, I know people dislike Discovery, but that series pretty much has people in tears every episode over something. They always find something to cry about on it. 1000%. It's kind of funny the way that EAE, it's kind of funny the way that if you watch TNG, no one has proper emotions. Almost no one has proper emotions. So there's an episode, which I don't remember the name of it, but all the kids get kidnapped by this planet of people who are sterile. So they kidnap all the kids from the Enterprise, and all the parents are sitting in the observation lounge talking about like, oh man, our kids are gone. And their reaction is so, I mean, they could be talking about the company picnic. They're just like, oh, what a shame. Our children are missing. How will we go and find them? We are not sure. There's no emotions. There's no emotions. Or there's the episode Eye of the Beholder, where there's this half Beta Z person who ends up jumping into some plasma warp field because of this mental imprint of a horrible memory that wasn't even his that caused him to do this. Well, anyways, Counselor Troy is investigating and talks to his fiance. And she's like, yeah, he was such a sweet kid. And you're like, what kind of reaction is that to you just lost your fiance in this horrible way? There's like no emotions at all. And the funny thing is Discovery is the opposite. Discovery, it's almost like they looked at that and they were like, we can do better. And on Discovery, they cry about everything. They're like, the sun is so beautiful. Oh my God. You know, like every time you turn around, they are just bursting into tears. They have like, I almost feel like, since I'm not the crying type of person, I almost feel like it's too much emotions. But when I look at it compared to TNG, where there was like no appropriate emotions, I'm like, okay, well, I think I'd rather have somebody crying when something's sad than just being like, my child was kidnapped. What a shame. You know, like I want to see some rage or fear or sadness or anxiety or literally any emotion at all in response to that situation. Let's see. Now for some reason the chat just started turning into a I hate these people clubs. So a lot of people have different clubs that they're in about all the people that they hate. PS2 Cypher says And then Princess wants to enter these clubs of people that you guys hate, which is hilarious. PS2 Cypher says that's why I like Star Trek. The crew acted like true professionals. Yeah, professionals, sometimes they acted really professional because it was a situation like when Kalar came on board and the first time and Worf was like, I don't want to work with her because she's my ex. And Picard was like, get it together, be a professional. And Worf was like, oh, my bad, I am a professional, and then was able to work with her. I appreciate that. That to me is professional. But when your kid's been kidnapped and you have no emotions, that to me is robotic. Like, there are certain scenarios where I would not be professional. Or let me put it this way. There are scenarios where if someone was not professional in that scenario, I'd be like, yeah, that tracks, right? Where I wouldn't be like, oh my goodness, we're in a board meeting. You know what I mean? There's times where you're like, yeah, that tracks. Like, that behavior makes sense in that scenario. PS2 Cypher says, not a fan of the newer Star Trek, but there's so many Star Treks. Maybe you need to watch more of them because there's got to be one of the newer ones you like. There's like 5 or 6 new shows. Plus, there's a new movie coming out and another show coming out. Maybe you just haven't seen your one yet. I think this is probably true. Michelle says, I am dying over here. Andrea and her Lwaxana hate. You guys need to watch Deep Space Nine. She gets redeemed. I have heard that more than once, and I believe that. So it's on my list, Michelle. Nadia says, Kalar's death. That one's cry-worthy. PS2 Cypher says, season 3 of Picard was good. Nadia says, you could do a whole episode of how people who are close to Worf are the unluckiest people. Just saying. Or maybe Worf's the unluckiest person. Maybe that's the episode. Is like the tragic life and times of Worf Rashenko. Moog. Okay, with that said, let's hit number 7 on the list. Season 3, Episode 5, The Bonding. Jeremy Astor's mom dies tragically in an away mission led by Worf. In the midst of grieving, his mom suddenly appears in his quarters and promises him a better life off the ship. After most of the crew intervenes, we discover that Ghost Mom is actually an alien partially responsible for Marla's death who just wants to make amends. The crew convinces both her and Jeremy that grief is a natural part of the human condition which cannot and should not be avoided. Ghost Mom disappears, and Jeremy agrees to bond with Worf. This episode is actually legit really sad. Yeah, Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, TNG loved traumatizing children. They really did. In fact, I have an entire video about how traumatized the children on TNG are. And so I'll link that in the description after this. But this episode is legitimately sad. So all the episodes before have been like, they've had sad moments or sad parts, or in the case of Force of Nature, they were just super depressing. But this one's legitimately sad. So Marla Astor, Jeremy's mom, gets killed on this away mission by a total accident, which obviously, like, when people die on away missions, it's almost always an accident. There wasn't a firefight. There wasn't a war. They weren't going to some hostile location. They just found this planet that was like uninhabited. And so they went to explore it. And while they're walking through a corridor, some landmine or something blew up and it killed Marla Astor. And then when they returned to the planet later to figure out what happened, every single landmine was unearthed. So it turns out that there were, I guess, three alien species on this planet. There were 2 species that were at war with each other, but those like died out or killed each other or something. Those ones are gone. But then the 3rd species that's left is this like shape-shifting energy species, the one that turned into Ghost Mom. And they, since they're non-corporeal, they live in the space, but there's no fear or danger of them stepping on a landmine because they don't have feet. Right. So they just left everything. They left all the ruins there. They left all the bombs there, and they didn't really trip on it. But when the away team came and Marla Astor died and they became aware of it, they were like, oh, shoot. And so they unearthed every single mine. So when the away team came back, or if any other, people come to this planet, they can see where all the bombs are so they won't step on them accidentally. So like, I think that speaks to the character of these non-corporeal aliens. They were non-hostile. They weren't trying to hurt anybody. It was a total accident. Unfortunately, it left poor Jeremy Astor totally orphaned, right? We don't know what happened to his dad, but we know he was alone on the ship with his mom. And what I think is worse than the fact that he lost his only parent was that these aliens recreate Marla Astor, and they come back and they're like, "Come to the planet, we'll give you everything you need." And I just think that's really cruel to do. So I was about Jeremy's age when I lost my dad, and had somebody proposed this to me as a kid, I would have jumped on it in a second. I would have been on that planet so fast. I would have absolutely gone with Ghost Dad. I would have done it. I would have for sure gone. I would have bought the whole farm. And maybe someday I would have been like, huh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But as a kid, absolutely. And I feel like watching that, I can feel Jeremy's pain. And also it's like, man, that's so cruel, because not only are you extending his grief, but you're often offering him a fantasy that's never going to live up to reality. Because even though you have Marla's body shape and voice and stuff like that, you don't have all of her memories as far as we know. And I guess there's probably some kind of telepathic something going on with Jeremy, where the ghost can can pull things from his mind to be how Marla would potentially react to things. But that's not the same. And he would figure that out eventually. He'd be like, why don't you remember this about, why can't you tell me my first word? Why can't you remember all these other things, right? Because Ghost Mom wasn't like, hey, I'm an alien pretending to be your mom. Ghost Mom was like, I'm your mom. I didn't actually die. Everyone was wrong. They tricked you. I'm totally alive. Come down to the planet. We're going to have so much fun. So like, that's where the alien went wrong. Trying to make amends, I get it. Trying to help Jeremy not be so sad, I get it. But pretending to be his mom when you're not his mom, and lying to him to tell him you're his mom, and lying to him and telling him on the planet it's going to be sunshine and roses. And since they have all this technology to they even decorate his quarters so it looks like the home that they had back on whatever planet they used to live on, or colony they used to live on. So they have some kind of technology to like replicate or create things on the fly. So I guess they could create a whole community, a whole population of people for Jeremy to interact with, but that's still not the same. And that's the point that Troy makes when they're all having this intervention and they're talking to Ghost Mom, and she's like, I don't see the problem. What's the problem? I just want the kid to be happy. He was super sad. Now he's super happy. What's the problem? And Troy was like, okay, you can give him food and shelter, but can you give him people? Can you give him community? Can you give him intellectual growth and emotional growth? And she's like, well, we can give him everything he needs. What about when he's ready to date or get married? What about when he wants to have children? What about when he wants to, like, there's all these things where he needs to be around corporeal people. Like, he needs to be around people for his growth and development. And she's not really swayed by that. She's like, nah, my way's better. And then it's not until all of the crew who, a bunch of the crew members who've had these tragic losses are all talking to Jeremy about how their particular loss helped them as a person, and how it was really sad and really hard, but important for them to be able to let the people they love go. And for some reason that works. And like, once Ghost Mom realizes that Jeremy's in good hands and that everyone's going to take care of him, because that was the concern, is that now he doesn't have a mom, he'll be like thrown to the wolves or something. But now that she knows he will be taken care of, she's like, okay, I understand. I'm out of here. So she leaves. So now poor Jeremy is back to where he started, with no mom, not even a ghost mom. And it's like, you just set back his whole healing by who knows how long with all this stuff you messed up his head with. Not, she wasn't doing it to be cruel, but I think it ended up being extremely cruel. And then in the end, he ended up bonding with Worf, which is kind of like, Worf is like, well, since I'm the one who was responsible for the away mission and for your mom, I'm kind of responsible for her death. So now we're bonded as siblings. So now you're like my brother, you're my family. Since you don't have family anymore, now you're my family. And then he also says like he doesn't have family because he's an orphan. So now they're like brothers. But then we never hear about Jeremy again. So I wonder if he just shipped Jeremy off to the Rashenkos like he did with Alexander, or more likely, Jeremy has other family members, maybe even his dad for all we know, but Jeremy has other family members maybe back on Earth or on another ship, so that way he could go and be with family and still grow and develop. I do wish we got a Where Are They Now for this little boy, and we don't. Or maybe we do in fanfic, I don't know. But we don't. And anyways, this episode is really sad. And like I said, as someone who lost my dad young, this one hits home, and this one is definitely one of the ones that makes me cry. And it makes me cry more for like Jeremy's loss and the fact that he's not able to grieve until all of these mind games are over. And I don't know, like, he is supported, but this kind of grief in general, even if you have support, it's a solo journey sometimes, right? Because it's what's going on in your head and your heart. And I think that's just really hard. Okay, so I'm going to check the chat and then we're going to hit number 6 on the list. Um, Wingrace says, poor Jeremy, what a disaster. But as a pun, I get it. I see what you did there. um, Michelle says, did she wear her red shorts that day? And then she says, I meant shirt. I think it's funnier. Did she wear red shorts that day? That's probably what happened. Princess says, what happened with Ian, Una Ortegas, and Vega, etc., to enter McCoy, Sulu, check. So I think you're saying what happened to all of the characters from what happened to all the characters from the original series and what happened to all the characters from Strange New Worlds, I think is what you're saying. So this episode is all about Star Trek The Next Generation. So that's why I'm not bringing in Voyager or Lower Decks or Prodigy or Strange New Worlds or TOS. But yes, there are a lot. If we did the 10 saddest episodes of all of Star Trek, I don't even think I could do that. I could do that, but I don't think I could do that because there's just so many. There's so many series to choose from, so many characters, so many episodes. It'd be a lot more. As it is, I go through every single episode of the show. So that's 178 episodes to pick my top 10. So if I went through all of the shows, I'd still be going through them right now. We wouldn't have a call right now. Nadia says, I wonder if Worf just shipped Jeremy off to the Roshenkos, LOL. OMG, best line of the night goes to Charisse. Thanks. Yeah, I do wonder that because I'm like, I mean, we see what he did with Alexander. So what makes us think that Jeremy is still like tooling around and he's still supporting him? I don't know. But with that said, let's go on to number 6. Let me just make sure. Yes. Let's go on to number 6 on the list. Season 3, Episode 3, The Survivors. The Enterprise discovers a planet where an entire civilization has been wiped out, except for an elderly couple, Kevin and Rashawn Uxbridge. It's clear that this couple has something to hide, as a mysterious alien ship keeps showing up to scare off the Enterprise. Also, Troy is being tortured with music only she can hear in order to compromise her telepathic abilities. Eventually, Kevin confesses that his wife died in the conflict on the planet, and in grief, he wiped out an entire alien race. Now, all he wants to do is live out the rest of his days in a fantasy land where he has recreated his beloved wife. This one is really sad, and it's actually not. It's not sad until the very end. Like, we don't even know it's sad. It kind of sneaks up on you. The whole time we're just kind of like, how mysterious, how strange. And then you get to the end and you're like, it's really heartbreaking. Princess Formidable says, this is sad. I agree. Wingrace says, yes, I've been waiting for this one. It's so heartbreaking, especially with the real world issues. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, the ending of this episode is great. The whole thing with Troy is completely unnecessary. I completely agree. PS2 Cypher says, is that knockoff Q? I would say that that Kevin is actually more powerful than Q in my mind, because in this episode, Kevin, he's a Dowd is the name of his species. He gets rid of an entire alien species with a thought, just like an angry thought. And Q, at the very least, has to snap or something. So, like, that tells me, like, he doesn't even have to snap. But yeah, this episode is really sad, but we don't know it's sad. Like, the whole time we're just kind of like, oh, how weird that we see this planet that's been totally devastated by some kind of war, but there's no one left. Nobody from the conflict is left on either side. So we're like, that's a little unusual, but there's this little patch of grass that you can see from space somehow, even though I think it's only like an acre, but you can see it from space, this little patch of grass. So the away team beams down to the little patch of grass on this whole barren planet. And you see Kevin and Rashawn just like sipping lemonade in their living room. And you're like, what the? y'all don't know this whole planet is barren? What happened? And the whole reason why the Enterprise came in the first place is because they got a distress signal from this planet. Like, that's why they were coming. And the distress signal was from the members that were in the conflict, the colonists that were in the conflict with some other alien species called the Husnock. So when the Husnock came, the colonists were all fighting, but Kevin is a pacifist. Not only is he super powerful, like one of the most powerful beings in all creation, but he's also a pacifist. He does not fight. He doesn't like a fight. So when this war broke out, he was like, I'm going to stay home and sip my lemonade. But his wife is a fighter. So she went and joined the colonists in the fight, and she was killed in the fight. And that's when he was so angry that he just destroyed everyone. And that's why the whole planet is barren. There's no one left because he destroyed everyone with thought. And then what he did was he recreated their little patch of heaven, their little patch of grass. He recreated their house. He recreated his wife so that way they can kind of live out their days as they were doing. He chose to age and, just experience life along with her and pretended to be human. And so at the end, when Picard realizes all of this and Kevin confesses to everything, Picard's like, well, we can't arrest you. We can't, what you've done doesn't even meet any of the laws we have. There's nothing. Furthermore, if you deleted an entire alien race with a thought, how are we going to keep you in a brig? You know what I mean? Like, what? You could just delete us with a thought as well. Like, you know what I mean? There's literally nothing we can do. So he just goes, I think, best thing for you to do is just go back to your planet and just do your thing. So Kevin goes back to the planet and keeps living his life with his fake wife. And Picard's like, with it being that powerful, the best thing to do is leave him alone and just fly the other way. Maybe launch a buoy, like leave this planet, maybe launch a little warning buoy outside of the planet. But yeah, this episode, that part was super sad. And also it turns out that actor's wife, the actor who played Kevin, his wife had actually passed away before filming this episode. And it was also his wife of, Andrea probably remembers, but like his wife of 30, 40, 50 years, similar to Kevin and Rashawn in the episode. So a lot of the emotions he was drawing from were probably his own lived experience, which makes it so much more, it's already heartbreaking. But the fact that the actor was, it's one thing when you're pretending, but the fact that the actor was experiencing the same tragedy in his real life is so heartbreaking. So this one's really sad. And I agree with Best of Trek, Worst of Trek. The thing with Troy was unnecessary. Well, the point was Kevin wanted to hide wanted to mess up her telepathic abilities so that she wasn't wise to the fact that he's not really human. But I feel like with all of his powers, he could have done that differently. I feel like he has enough powers to just shut off her telepathy when it comes to him, right? Like Betazoids can't read Ferengi's minds because their brains or something. So I feel like Kevin could have just done that. He could have just been like, no, you can't sense me. So I don't know why they didn't give him that power. And instead they had this whole B plot of Troy being like, oh, the music's so loud. And then she actually goes into like an induced coma or something because she can't function. And then at the end, Kevin comes and like touches her forehead or whatever and removes the music from her brain. And that's kind of messed up. Like, even though you're a pacifist, you're torturing her. I don't think you had to do that. And then that he had to like physically come and like remove the music from her brain so she could be untortured also seems like something he could have done from a distance, because the music getting in her brain, he did from a distance. He did from the planet when she was all the way on the ship. And maybe she could have sensed him from that far because he's so powerful. But again, because he's so powerful, he could have just said, no, you don't get to sense me. So I don't know. Princess says, why didn't he make the planet return? That's a good question. I don't know why he didn't make the entire planet return. His grief was really the loss of his wife, and he wanted her back. So he brought her back. He could have, in theory, returned not only the planet, but the Husnock as well, the entire alien species he obliterated. He could have just brought them all back. He could have brought them back at the moment of conflict, and he could have stopped their conflict. I think he has a lot of, from what they're saying about his powers, I think he could have made a lot of different choices. But I don't know why he didn't bring the whole planet back. That'd be my guess, is that he couldn't care less about the whole planet, but he was very connected to his wife. PS2 Cypher says, yep, sometimes the best thing to do is just walk away. Yep, and that's a choice too. And that's a choice I would have made. If I was faced with Kevin and his powers, I would have just been like, back away slowly, because you can't do anything. You can't hold him. You can't punish him. You probably can't kill him if somebody would want to do that, which the only people who would be the Husnock, who are now gone, or maybe the colonists' families because they're also gone. Um, Andrea says, if you had Kevin's powers, would you bring a loved one back knowing they weren't really there? Oh, that's such a good question. Yes. Yes, I would bring a loved one back. That's such a good question. If I had Kevin's powers, this is why I don't need Kevin's powers. If I had Kevin's powers, I wouldn't be losing loved ones in the first place. I'd be collecting loved ones. I'd be getting more and more loved ones. Everyone would be living forever, just like me. Yes, I don't think. But if I was in Kevin's situation where the person's already gone, you can recreate them so they act just like they did before. Like they have the same memories, the same mannerisms, and everything else. They make the same choices, but that's not really them. I don't know. It kind of reminds me of Noonien Sung when his wife died after that crystalline entity situation, and then he just recreated another wife as a robot, as an android, and then she ended up leaving him the same way his real wife would have left him if she had lived, but she got to live on her life the way that his wife would have. Um, Part of me feels like that is kind of selfish, right? To recreate somebody because of how they make you feel. But when it comes to losing a loved one, it hurts you personally because you're selfish. Like it hurts, right? It hurts you personally. It doesn't hurt someone, it hurts you. And that's the problem. So I don't know. That's a really good question, but I'm leaning towards yes. I think this question's always yes for me. Like I would do it. And then at some point I might be like, hey, this isn't real. Like, oh, this is fake. But I would probably do that as long as I could to just extend out the time before I have to actually grieve and say goodbye to that person. I probably would. Especially in this scenario where it's like you've been married 40 years. Yeah, let's just extend it. Let's extend it to another 30 years. Like, I probably would. Let me know what you would do. Let me know what you would do in the chat if you had Kevin's powers. Would you bring a loved one back knowing they weren't real? Princess says, I take it back. Which I'm not sure if you're saying you would bring them back or if you take back something you said earlier in the chat. Um, Michelle says Troy is always unnecessary. That's not true. She comes in so clutch in season 7. Like, and I think half of season 6. If it wasn't for her, the ship would have blown up tons of times. And then Andrea says, okay, Michelle, after telling me not to hate Lawaksana. So there we go. Wingrace says, would you recreate a lost loved one in the holodeck? No, that I would not do. And I think that's because in the holodeck, you are programming something. Like, I guess it's too easy for me to know that it's fake. If I'm sitting programming in someone's thoughts and memories and what, their journals or whatever, if I'm pulling a Leah Brahms and I'm trying to recreate someone in the holodeck, I wouldn't do that. Because the time and energy it would take to recreate them, I'd be grieving during that process. And by the time I finished, I would have to, the only way I could finish is if I told myself to stop grieving. Like, because I'm going to recreate, I'm going to make them. And then it's like it's giving myself this godlike power that I don't really have. I don't think I would ever get to the end of that program. But if I had Kevin's powers and I could instantly do it, yes, I would do it. If I had Ghost Mom's powers and I could just, some non-corporeal alien could just poof, instantly bring back a loved one who you've lost within 12 hours. Yeah, I would do that. Michelle says, I wouldn't. It would make me miss the real person even more. Yeah, I think that's something that Andrea says often too, of like, when you know it's fake, something about the fact that you know it's fake makes it even worse. Which I think there's an argument to be had for that for sure. Okay, moving on to number 5 on the list. Season 2, Episode 1, The Child. Counselor Troy gets impregnated by a ball of light and gives birth within 72 hours. Within a day or so after that, Ian is about 8 years old and he's getting the chance to play with other children on the ship. Eventually, however, he realizes that his presence is putting the entire ship in danger due to the radiation that he produces. So, he decides to leave the ship, but before he goes, he tells Troy that he's actually an alien life form who wanted to know more about humanoid species and thought that the best way to do that was by going through the process. So I have a lot of issues with this episode. The first issue being the fact that Troy gets impregnated against her will and is like first of all, who thought of this idea? And I realized that this idea was a holdover from TOS, like they really wanted to do it then and just couldn't fit it in the series and then threw it into this. But what? what? Like, the whole thought of this, I think, is awful. And then on top of that, when she's going through this whole process of giving birth, she's, like, so okay with it. And they do say, like, when she's actually giving birth, she has no birth pains. I think she just sneezes and the baby comes out. There's something that baby Ian is doing to her brain or her body or whatever, where she doesn't feel the pain of childbirth, which that actually sounds kinda nice. But it also makes me wonder, is Ian also doing something to her brain the entire time? Because she's not upset that she's pregnant. She's not weirded out. She's not afraid. She's not like, what the heck am I about to give birth to? She's just like, how lovely. Oh, oh dear, this is fun. Like, and she's like that the whole episode. Like, everything's just peaches and cream. So I wonder if what they were implying is that baby Ian, the alien, was somehow manipulating her mind so that she was okay with everything until the moment when he died. And then maybe her mind control came back and she was able to have like appropriate emotions to the situation. Anyways, okay, all that aside, the reason why this is on the list is I think losing a child is so heartbreaking. And I think Marina Sirtis, the actress who plays Troy, really showed that extremely well in this episode, which is just the last 2-3 minutes of the episode. So like I said in that little clip, Ian has to leave the ship because the whole ship is in danger because of his presence and all of this. And when he leaves, he turns back into that little ball of light, and then he like talks to Troy a little bit, and then he floats off. So when he's talking to her in that ball of light, that's when he's like, okay, just so you know, I'm an alien life form. This is the reason why I came. I just want to know more about you. Thanks so much for the good times. And I wish you all the best. Have a pleasant and professional summer. And then he flies through the window. And Troy is like, huh, and she says, we'll miss you and all these things. Before that, before they have this nice moment of closure, she's hugging his limp body to her chest and she's calling over to sickbay frantically, like, help me with my son. And that scene is like, it's so hard to watch. It's so hard to watch. Like, I can't even imagine how many times they had to film that over and over because, TV. But I think the idea of losing a child is extremely sad. Similar to the survivors, losing a spouse, I think is awful, which obviously, my mom experienced with my dad. And then losing a spouse that's been your partner for your entire life almost, right? It's like losing all of your limbs at once probably. But losing a child there's just something unnatural about that. Like, you're not supposed to outlive your child. And I think this episode hits it really nicely. There's another episode called Dark Page where Lwaxana is mourning the loss of a child that we did not know she had. And she's built up all these like mental barriers to try to forget that she had that child. That episode is trash. Don't bother. But this episode showcases what that episode should showcase, which is kind of the grief of a mother and all of that. But this episode is really more about Ian growing super fast and getting along with other people, the crew, and Troy becoming a mom all of a sudden and what that experience is like. So it's more of that part of it than the loss part of it. And then that Lwaxana episode is supposed to be more of the loss part of it, but it's done very, very strangely badly. Like, not well, not in a way where you connect emotionally. But yeah, this episode is super sad. This is another one I don't see. Like, I could rewatch this one. Because I do think the episode is done well, but there's just like so many issues with it that I have personally. And then also it's just really heartbreaking to see at the very end that all this was kind of for nothing. Anyways, I'm done talking. I'm going to check the chat and then we're going to hit episode number 5 on the list. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, Pulaski gets off to a great start. Some excellent abortion right talk, but what a strange overall topic. Yeah, this is season 2, episode 1. This is our first episode with Pulaski, our first episode with Guinan. We see O'Brien in this episode. And Pulaski's first conversation in the observation lounge is like, we need to terminate this pregnancy because Counselor Troy was not pregnant when she went to sleep last night, and now she is, and the baby's growing at such a rapid rate. She's going to give birth in 72 hours. We don't know what this thing is. So like, we should terminate it. And Troy's like, no, it's my baby and I'm having it. And then when she has the baby, we know how great the security is on any of these ships, which is not great, but there is a security detail that comes to sickbay. Because again, we don't know what's about to come out of Troy. It could be like an alien situation where it jumps out and we don't know what's happening. So the security come and they've like got their phasers trained on Troy while she's giving birth. And Pulaski's all like, is that really necessary? And Worf's like, yes, it's necessary. So it's like, Pulaski, pick a lane. Are we okay with this? Are we not okay with this? Pick a lane. Also, like you're in the front line of whatever the heck is about to come out of Troy. Thankfully, it was just a cute little baby that was half human, half Beta Z, just like Troy. It was an adorable little baby. There was nothing to be worried about. There was no danger, but nobody knew that ahead of time. Nadia says this episode is so upsetting on so many levels. It starts with Troy being violated and it ends with her kid dying. WTH, 1000%. 1000%. Eric says a mostly unwatchable episode. I definitely hear you there. The good thing, like the fun thing is seeing Guinan for the first time because you're like, oh my gosh, there she. Like for me, I felt like Guinan was on the show the whole time. I didn't realize that she didn't come in until season 2, until I watched this episode, and I was like, wait, what? I thought she's been here from day 1 on this ship. So that was the good thing about the episode. Let's see. PS2 Cypher says here for a good time, not a long time. Yeah, I think Ian's whole time on the ship is probably a week, probably like a solid week. Sorry, 1 second. My mom is calling. I think his time on the ship is like a solid week because counting the ball of light impregnating Troy all the way till when he disappears in a ball of light, I think it's probably like about 5 or 6 days, which is wild. Michelle says, I may not be the biggest Troy fan, but I felt awful for watching this episode. It was heartbreaking. Yeah. I feel like that's one of those things. And I feel like that's what was missed in the Luoxana episode is that whether you like Troy or not, when you watch this episode, you're like, oh my gosh, what just happened? But the Luoxana episode, you're just like, what just happened? Right? You don't have the like connection to Luoxana and her grief and the connection to Troy and what she's figuring out and all of that. So I do think they did hit those emotional notes at the very end. Okay, now to number 4 on the list. Season 4, Episode 7, Reunion. Worf reunites with Kalar and discovers he has a son. At the same time, Chancellor Kimpek is assassinated, and there's a messy bid for control of the Klingon Empire. Somehow Kalar gets drawn into the conflict and is murdered by Duras. And just like that, Worf becomes a father and a single father, all at the same time. So this episode has a lot of issues also, but I actually like this episode. There is so much going on. And I know not everybody is a Klingon fan. Some people love the Klingons. Some people are just not fans of the Klingons. But I love this Klingon episode. I love these Klingon episodes that show like the intrigue and the politics and stuff like that. Because I feel like the world building is just showing such a more dynamic culture than like, we just like to fight. You know, it's like, no, there's all kinds of things going on. There's power struggles and all of this, especially when this episode starts with Kimpek calling in Picard. And he's like, well, actually, this episode starts with Kalar showing up with a child out of nowhere and being like, surprise, you're a daddy. But she doesn't even say that. She makes Worf guess. She like does not say it until Worf finally says, is that my child? Tell me. And then she's just like, I can't believe you even have to ask. You're like, girl, what is going on? So that's actually how it starts. But shortly after that, we see Kimpek call in Picard and say, I've been assassinated. And he's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, I've been poisoned, like slowly over time. And now it's built up so much that I only have a matter of hours or days or whatever. And now the not throne, but like the court, you know, all of the people who are in charge of the government for the Klingon Empire, now there's going to be chaos and infighting. And you see that throughout this episode. And Kalar is a Klingon ambassador, and so she's a part of the negotiations. And because Picard was brought in as Kimpek's something or other, the arbiter for who should succeed Kimpek. So now they have to prove to Picard why they should succeed. It's just all these things. So I really like this episode because it's got all those layers. But man, Kalar's brutal death was shocking. I remember watching this episode. I did not see that coming at all. I was so surprised by Alexander. And I was like, I can't believe he has a kid. I can't believe Kalar never said anything. I mean, what the heck has she been telling Alexander? Has she told him he has a dad? Has she told him your dad is Worf and he's in Starfleet? Like, what? Surely this kid has asked many, many times, who's my dad? Where's my dad? Why isn't he here? We don't get any of those answers. She just shows up like with a kid and doesn't say, this is yours. Like, there's none of, we don't get any satisfaction on any of that because before they can have that conversation, Kalar is brutally murdered. And the scene is really sad too, because Worf and Alexander are walking over to Kalar's quarters and they're just like walking through the hall and they open the door and they just see her in a room covered in blood. And it's like, what the heck? So shocking, so surprising. She is still alive. And with her last dying breath, she says Alexander, and then she puts their hands together and then she dies. So yeah, it gets me every time. It really breaks my heart. It's really so sad. And then Worf is like so upset and he howls and he screams. And then, of course, he avenges her. He goes and fights Duras, like in the next, a couple scenes later. And Duras is like, Worf, how are you getting in this fight? You have nothing to do with trying to rule anything. And Worf is like, I couldn't care less about ruling anything, but Kalar was my mate. And Duras is like, ooh, I didn't know that. You guys should have let me know because then I would have maybe done things differently. Too late for that now. So they get in a knife fight, and Worf puts it into him, which is why the Duras sisters come up with Plan B later on with little Duras. But yeah, this episode, it's got a lot of layers. This is a good one. This is definitely one I would recommend watching. But that death scene is really sad. It gets me every time, and I really like Kalar as a character. And I'm so bummed we didn't see any more of her. We just see her 2 times. This actress, we see her a bunch of times, but Kalar, we see only 2 times, and she's such a cool character. I would have loved to see her a little more, but oh well. And then after this, with Kalar's dying breath, she's like, Worf and Alexander, be family. That's her dying wish. And what happens immediately after this? Worf ships Alexander off to the Rashenkos. And it's like, I get it. You weren't a dad yesterday, as far as you knew. And now there's all these responsibilities, and you're on this freaking flagship that's always running into the Borg and who knows what. And maybe you don't want him to be in danger. But also, this was your mate's dying wish, was for you to be a father to your child. So shipping him off to the Rashenkos immediately, not the best move, right? You didn't even try. You didn't even try to get to know this kid. But it all worked out because the Rashenkos shipped him back. And so Worf had to deal with this new little human being, or not human being, this new little Klingon, and had to deal with how do I adjust my life now, which is like a whole nother story. That's a whole nother episode. Okay, going into the chat. I'm already seeing people who are not in the Alexander fan club. Let's see. PS2 Cypher says, that was a sad episode. I completely agree. Nadia says, now this is a good episode, except when he makes Alexander stare at Kalar's dead body. Yeah. And then Michelle says, ugh, Alexander, the worst Star Trek child ever. Sorry, Worf. Eric says, the saddest part of this is knowing that Alexander's trauma is just beginning. I know, poor thing. So Alexander, because I did the math, of course I did. I was like, how long has it been? Because Alexander in this episode is like 5 years old, like 4 or 5 years old. Like, he's pretty big. And I was like, was it that long ago that they hooked up? So I did the math, and it was like a year previous or something like that. It was not that long ago. But when I was like kind of deep diving into this particular episode, I found that they were like that none of the people on the show wanted to put prosthetics on an infant, which totally makes sense. So they were like, they kind of took a book out of soap operas and just said, just age him up. So they just like made him 4 or 5. And then the next time we see him, when the Rashenkos drop him off, he's maybe like 8 or 9. And then I guess I wouldn't know about Deep Space Nine. Let me know, Michelle, how old he was in that, but maybe he's like a teenager or something. So they just age him up really quickly, which I'm totally okay with that. We don't need to see a little baby. Like, we already have enough things going on in this ship. So I'm glad he was old enough to like walk and talk and all of that. But yeah, let's just pretend he's 4 or 5. He's 4 or 5, living the life with his ambassador mom, traveling the galaxy. And now suddenly it's like, now he's, on Earth as one of the few Klingons, just like Worf was. And then it's like, nope, now he's kicked back to the Enterprise, and he's got to figure out life aboard this ship. And his mom, apparently, Kalar, raised him basically as human, so he probably would have done better on Earth. I don't know. Because Worf wants to raise him as a Klingon warrior, and he wants to be raised as a human. He's like, I don't want anything to do with Klingon warrior stuff. And Worf is like clutching his pearls, because that's what it means to be Klingon. You got to love the Klingon stuff. And so that adds up a lot of, creates a lot of tension between them. And yeah, poor Alexander just doesn't have a good experience, really, from the moment this tragic episode happens. But also poor Worf, because like Alexander is a handful and a half. Absolutely. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, this hits me in the feels every time. This is maybe Worf's best episode ever. Yeah, I could see that. Oh, Michelle, I see what you did there. Yeah, so, Kalar was so cool. I was so mad when she died, right? Like, we only got her twice? That feels like such a rip off. I'm glad we got her a second time, but man, her ending was spectacular. I feel like that's the kind of ending Yar should have had in the beginning without doing some Yesterday's Enterprise nonsense. Actually, not nonsense. I like Yesterday's Enterprise, but without having to bring her back several seasons later to give her a proper ending. She should have had a Kalar ending from the beginning. Do something that like go out in a blaze of glory because that is who Tasha Yar is. So if we're gonna lose Kalar, we need to lose her like battling because of some like Klingon intrigue. Um, PS2 Cypher says Alexander was a crew member by the end of DS9. Really? And then Michelle says he's an adult in DS9. Wow. That's very okay. They aged him up way more than I thought they did because he was only like 8 at the end of TNG. So, how'd that happen? Michelle says, and he's still annoying. Poor Alexander. Okay, on to number 3 on the list. Season 5, Episode 25, The Inner Light. A mysterious probe latches onto Captain Picard and transports him to the planet Catan. There he lives an entire lifetime and watches helplessly as his planet slowly dies. Eventually, he is reunited with the family and friends that he's lost along the way as they tell him that all of this was an elaborate simulation to help preserve the memory of their culture. He awakes on the bridge about 25 minutes after the probe was activated, and the only thing remaining, other than his memories, is a Resican flute. This episode is so heartbreaking. It is it's arguably one of the it's a fan favorite. It's one of the most favorite episodes of all people who watch TNG. Um and you see why. Like I mean it did make me and Andrea's list on the podcast just because this episode it wasn't about Picard as Picard. It was about Picard as an alien on this planet. However, this episode is so beautiful. I think one of the reasons why it's so heartbreaking is because you get to see Picard in this world live his entire life. So you get to see all the challenges, the wins and the losses throughout his life, and I think that's what makes it hard. It's not just like one moment in time. It's not just like even with Kalar where we got to see her twice. There's like history, there's backstory there. That's why it sucks when we lose her because you feel like, no, not Kalar. But this is like, you didn't just lose your spouse, which he does in this episode. He does lose his spouse. She dies before he does. He just gets super old. He loses all of his friends. He outlives everyone. And he lives to see like their star go supernova or something like that. But he loses an entire culture, an entire planet, like his whole history. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Benjamin Button. You know how that movie spans an entire lifetime? So at the end of the movie, you're like, like what just happened to me? Because it's so much crammed into like an hour and a half or 2 hours where you're like, I just experienced so much to take in and to process emotionally. That's what Inner Light is. It's a whole lifetime of emotions. And it is really sad. This is one of those episodes, probably these last couple of episodes, these are ones that I can't watch without crying. Like this is one of those ones, it just breaks my heart. And that flute at the end, not only is it beautiful that he's playing this flute that he took a lifetime to learn, but before he plays it, which I didn't notice until today, rewatching the episode, is Riker comes in and hands him the flute. He says, this was found in the probe or whatever. And he hands him the flute and he takes out the flute and he just kind of holds it. He just holds it against his chest and he just like paces back and forth holding the flute. And it's like, how in the world do you process this and move forward? You just lived an entire lifetime and then you wake up and 25 minutes have passed. So you have a whole nother lifetime, but this lifetime does not include all the people you just had a lifetime with. How do you process that? Why is he in his quarters at all? Why is he not talking to Counselor Troy right now? And doing some kind of deep therapy. But yeah, it's really beautiful. And the song is really beautiful. And it also makes me wonder, because all they had left was a flute, was part of their plan that whoever the probe connected to would learn to play the flute? And if so, how the heck do they do that? I don't know. The technology is really amazing. I hope I never run into technology like this. I hate the idea of my brain being sucked into another reality and living an entire lifetime, and where they try to make me feel like I'm the crazy one for thinking that I used to live on a starship. And then in the end being like, psych, you did live on a starship. Like this was all a simulation just so that our culture would move on, would live on inside of you. Thanks so much. Um, I'd rather have this be like a movie or something, or like a holodeck or something like that I could voluntarily experience, as opposed to something that like sticks my. And even if I was to voluntarily experience this holodeck program, I wouldn't want a whole entire lifetime. I mean, I don't know. I think that is what makes it so heartbreaking. But it's a beautiful episode, and it makes me cry every time. Okay, I'm gonna check the chat, and then we're gonna hit episode number 2 on the list. Michelle says, "Uh-oh, hold on. I went back to how annoying Alexander is. Let me scroll." Michelle says, "This was one of my favorite episodes. We got to see a whole other side to Picard. We did, and we got to see the part where he no longer despises children, right? We got to see a part where he's a family man of all things, where he's a part of the community, which right now in the Enterprise, he's the leader of a community, but in the Inner Light, he's a member of the community, a contributing member. He's like one of the crew, as opposed to being the boss, which is just a totally different dynamic." Wingrace says, "Plain, simple flute." Thank you, Wingrace. Michelle says, "I wonder if Patrick Stewart kept the flute from the set." I wonder too. Probably somebody knows that. My bet would be that that's like a piece that's been auctioned off, and that's now standing behind glass in somebody's living room or something. That'd be my guess. Okay, so number 2 on the list. Let's hit it. Season 3, Episode 16, The Offspring. Data creates a daughter, Lol, in his pursuit to experience parenthood and further understand humanity. Lol fits right in with the crew and starts developing in leaps and bounds. Unfortunately, Starfleet Command is not as excited about this. Admiral Halftel wants to study Lol in a sterile environment away from the only home she's ever known. This puts her into a tailspin, causing her neural net to fail and her life to be terminated. Data stores her memories and experiences inside his own neural net so that she will never be forgotten. This one also makes me cry every time. I've been watching this. This is definitely on my rewatch list. These last few are on my rewatch list. They're not like the first few where I'm like, maybe you can give this one a skip. This one, this is one of my favorite episodes of all time. Data is my favorite character from TNG. So of course, like a data-centered episode, I'm all about that life. But this episode is so heartbreaking. Again, it's the loss of a child, similar to The Child, except for all of this is voluntary, right? He chose to create this child. The child is growing and learning. And then Admiral Halftel comes in and is like, I want a piece of that, for whatever reason, and ruins the whole thing. And I wonder, like, what could Lal have become if Admiral Halftel hadn't jumped in and ruined her life? And I also am always irritated when I watch this episode. There's a scene where Admiral Halftel asks Data, "Can I help you try to save Lal?" And Data's like, "Of course, I would love your assistance," because he's Data and he doesn't hold grudges. So they're in there and they're, trying to do their thing. And then they realize it's not going to work. And Admiral Halftel comes out to tell Wesley, Troy, and Geordi, the first people who saw Lal when Data finished building it at the time, which became a her. The same people who were there at the beginning or the same people who were there at the end. And Admiral Halftel comes out and he's all sad and he's like, "We tried our best. Data, he worked like a madman, but it just didn't work out. So sad." And he walks away all sad. And I'm like, you're the reason this happened. I do want you to be sad, but I also want you to be like, I can't believe I did this or something. But of course that doesn't happen. Anyways, that's the only part of this episode that irritates me every time I watch the episode. I'm like, I keep looking for some kind of contrition or something, but that's never going to happen because the show has been filmed and shot and it is what it is. But this episode is really beautiful, really heartbreaking. I love seeing Lal grow and develop. I love seeing her, her missteps and just the things that would be weird when you think about it. And it's like the ultra Data, right? Because Data's always looking at humanity and kind of trying to figure them out. And Lal is vocalizing all of these things about humanity, like what's going on there and why are they doing that? And what, and I love that. I love the daddy-daughter part of them. I love that Data's going around asking for parenting advice. I think that's really sweet. And I love how Picard stands up for Data and is like, no, you're not going to relinquish your child. Absolutely not. And Admiral Halftel's like, I order you. And Picard's like, belay that. This is your child. We don't order people to give up their children. That's not going to happen. I love it when Picard steps up and is like, Data's a person who has rights. So back off. Like, I love those moments. So we get all of that in this lovely episode. It's one of the most sad episodes in TNG. It's not the most sad because we have one more episode left, but it's definitely one that, similar to Inner Light, and similar to seeing Kalar die in Reunion, it's one of those ones that gets me every time. Like, no matter how many times I see it, it's always like, oh, especially that final scene where Lal is kind of going backwards in all the things she learned. So all that stuff that on that first day where Data was teaching her about flowers and Guinan was teaching her about kissing because she was watching people kiss in 10 Forward. And she's like, as her brain is shutting down, and she's like, kissing, flowers. And she just kind of shuts down. Oh, it just gets me every time. Gets me every time. Okay, check in the chat. Nadia says, lol, oh man, I can hardly ever watch this episode. It's so sad, especially the line where she says, I love you, father. Yeah, she's like, I love you, father. And Data goes to say, I love you too, but he doesn't because he doesn't have emotions. So he goes, I wish I could say the same, but I can't. And you're like, oh, I love that he's honest, but man, like, if only he could lie, you know? And she's like, I know. And she says, I'll feel it enough for the both of us. And it's like, oh, man, just gets me every time. PS2 Cypher says, I hate how that episode was never followed up on. It sort of was in Picard season 1, but it never was in TNG because we don't get a Where Are They Now? They just disappear forever. Okay, Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, the Inner Light flute was auctioned off. Do you know how much it was auctioned off for? Because I'm just really curious. I feel like it was probably a lot because there's so much emotional value connected to that, especially for a fan. Like, I wonder. I bet you it was a lot. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, this might be the biggest tearjerker in TNG for me. And Halftel is one of those guys that makes me believe that most admirals are bad guys. So Best of Trek, Worst of Trek and I were having this conversation about his belief that admirals are just like all bad. Like, they're all evil and they make terrible decisions, or not terrible decisions, but they always make decisions that are like, what did you say? I think you said morally questionable or something like that. They're always making these really unethical choices. So, like, whenever we see them in the show, it like probably more often than not, when you see an admiral show up in TNG, they're about to do something shady. Every once in a while, they're not. They're just sending Picard on a little adventure. But probably more often than not, they're doing something really shady. And I had never noticed this before. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek pointed that out. But in rewatching, that's kind of true. And I like to think that this is not most admirals. Most admirals are just regular admins in my mind. But a handful of them are up to shady stuff. And they're the ones that we bring in for really great episodes. That's what I think. PS2 Cypher says, you don't get to be an admiral without being a bad guy. Just ask Janeway. Doesn't Picard become an admiral too, though? Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says, the flute went for between 10 to 20K, which is wild. Wild. Nadia says, I think the Ruskin flute was auctioned off for 6 figures. So there you go. And now she has to look it up. So yeah, let us know. Okay. Whoa. The flute was auctioned for $237,000 in 2021. So I'm guessing it was maybe auctioned off for $10,000 or $20,000 probably in 1995 when the show was off. And then whenever the collector wanted to sell it, it was auctioned again and again and again. And this was like the latest auction. $237,000. Talk about an investment piece. That's wild. PS2 Cypher says, I waited till no end for them to mention Lal. I never heard the name drop once in Picard season 1. No, they did not say the name Lal in Picard season 1. But what's her name? Daj, the main girl, is Lal's daughter. Or is Data's daughter. So it's like Lal 2.0. And the way they explain it is that it's the like next generation of Sung type androids, and they're all based kind of off Lal. That's why she was a woman, and like kind of the way her hair looked and the way she like tilted her head, it was like Lal and some of those things. But yeah, no, they never said the name Lal. They never said Lal again. Oh, maybe I was wrong. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says Lal was mentioned in season 3. She was one of the sets of memories inside of the new Data. I'm giving a face. Because I did not like what they did to Data in Resurrection. And then they were like, Psych and Picard, and they try. That's a whole nother video. That's a whole nother video. But okay, lol was mentioned in passing in a memory in season 3 of Picard. So all you had to do, PS2 Cypher, was wait like 30-ish years, and then you did hear her name mentioned one more time. PS2 Cypher says, yeah, not the same thing. Yeah, not the same thing. Oh, and that you caught that name drop, and that's why season 3 was good. I didn't catch the name drop. I missed it completely. Okay, now on to number 1 on the list, the, to me, saddest episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Season 7, Episode 15, Lower Decks. In this episode, we get a glimpse into the junior officers aboard the Enterprise. Yes, this is the inspiration for the animated series Lower Decks. While learning about their ambitions, friendships, and struggles, Ensign Sito is sent on a dangerous covert mission into Cardassian space. While awaiting her return, they discover that her ship was destroyed and that she was killed, leaving her colleagues shocked and heartbroken. This episode is so painful to watch. This is a really good episode, and I feel like it's kind of an under the radar episode. Because it's not about the main crew, it's not about the bridge crew that we're used to seeing, it's not about the chiefs of everything, the chief security, the chief medical officer, the chief engineer. It's not about any of those people. It's about all these junior officers who are making their way up. And sometimes these episodes can be like throwaway episodes, right? You're like, oh, great, now I'm learning about a bunch of other people that I don't know about and will never see again. But this episode is actually really nice for a couple reasons. One, Ensign Sito is not a random ensign like some of the other ensigns. We do see Nurse Agawa, who is not an ensign, or maybe she is. Maybe they're all ensigns. I don't even know. But we've seen her a ton of times. Like we've seen her all the way since season 2 or season 1. And the other people are new. But Sito actually was in the episode where, I forget the name of it. Somebody will probably know in the chat. But she was in the episode with Wesley when he was at the academy, and they were doing some illegal maneuver showboating, and one of their classmates died doing this illegal maneuver, and then they all try to cover it up and say that classmate was just like unhinged or mentally unstable and all the other things so that they wouldn't get in trouble. But then eventually Wesley was like, no, like I have to, my first duty is to the truth. I have to tell the truth. And so he tells the whole truth. And then Nick Locrino gets expelled and then becomes Tom Paris. And then like his life is made miserable. Wesley's life is made miserable at the academy, but he eventually leaves anyway, so it doesn't matter. Sito, however, finishes the academy, and then turns out, we find out in this episode, that Picard hand selects her to come serve on his ship because he felt like no one else would give her a chance because of the mark on her record of being a dishonest office, a potentially dishonest officer who you can't trust with your life and all of these things. So Picard requested that she be put onto his ship so that she would have a chance to show that she's more than that. She's more than her record. Unfortunately, the first chance she gets to go on a away mission, she's killed. How sad is that? We never get to see her true potential. The only thing we see in this episode, we get to see all this banter between the junior officers, which is lovely. And then she goes on this mission that Picard could not order her to go on because it was so dangerous. But she volunteered because it was something that was going to help the Bajoran people in some kind of way, I believe. And since she's Bajoran, she's only Bajoran on the ship at this moment, I think. Because Ro might have already gone off to do whatever she was doing. She agrees, she goes on the mission, and then the whole thing was she was going to be the prisoner, the fake prisoner of this Cardassian. They were going to fly across the neutral zone into Cardassian space, and then he was going to like go to this other, like beam over to some other ship or something like that. And then she was supposed to pretend like she's escaping, and she was supposed to take the shuttle back across the line. But the other ships that were there, he was supposed to run interference so that they didn't fire on her, or so she escaped before they could fire on her, and she got across to Federation space. But I think like 2 ships ended up showing up instead of 1 or something like that. We don't really know. We just know that while they're waiting for her and they're scanning, they end up finding debris all over the place, and they know that it's her ship. And it's just like, it's really sad. Here's why I put it as the saddest episode. Not only does it make me cry every time when you get to the end and Picard is just like saying, hate to let everybody know, but this is what happened. And you see all of her friends like, what? Not only that, which is so sad, makes me cry, but also that it was such a shock. This was not supposed to be a sad episode. Like, there was nothing in this episode that warned me that sadness was coming. It was just like a fun little episode about side characters we'll never see again. And I remember viscerally watching this episode and being like, oh, how interesting. We're learning about other people. Oh, that's kind of cool. And then this happened, and I was just like I felt shocked like her friends were. Like, what just happened? And it was just like, isn't that sad? End of episode. Like, similar to Kalar, we need more of this instant. Like, we need more of her story. We need more. Which is super sad. So yeah, this is my number one pick. It breaks my heart every time. And I'm going to read the chats. And then we're going to get to our Trek trivia question for the day. Nadia says, Lower Decks, nice choice. Yeah, this episode's really good. Best of Trek, Worst of Trek says the first duty is the Academy episode. Thank you. And I even quoted it, right? The first duty is to the truth, but I couldn't remember the name of the episode. Yeah, the first duty is the name of the episode. I don't love that episode, but I feel like you need to watch that episode to get this episode. And I actually really like this episode. I don't love this either because it's so sad. So it's hard to watch it over and over because you're just like, it's just like getting your heart ripped out of your chest over and over and over. But it's a really good one, and it made my top list. So these were the top 10 saddest TNG episodes, in my opinion. But I want you to stay tuned because I have a Trek trivia question coming up. And if you have not already done this, be sure to like and subscribe. Okay, Wingrace says, I love this episode. I was scared they were going to undo it in Lower Decks, but they just added to the impact while not reversing the death. Yeah, and it's really interesting too because Lower Decks is a comedy, right? Like, it's so silly and fun. And this episode is it's a little silly, but like this episode's definitely a bummer, right? This episode's not like if you watch this episode Lower Decks, you wouldn't be like, let's do a comedy. You know what I mean? You'd watch this episode and be like, wow, that was sad. But Lower Decks, I think, is genius. I love that we're seeing all of the junior crewmen and kind of what they're going through. So I think it was a good idea all around. Okay, with that, let me go to our Trek trivia question of the day.